Hello and welcome to our January third-party Roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today we have our industry expert, Jon Cassel, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. And with that, Jon Cassel.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending. Today, I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party products that have received updates since the start of the year. I do want to mention that even though we'll be covering just third-party applications in this webcast, we'll still be using the Microsoft Patch Tuesday, that is the second Tuesday of the month, as our reference point going forward. Most manufacturers actually have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, Microsoft has been using the second Tuesday of the month for well over a decade now, and some manufacturers have actually since followed suit, such as Adobe. Before we start, let's briefly discuss what a vulnerability is versus a patch. A vulnerability is a bug or misconfiguration in a product, application, or operating system that, if exploited, allows that product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or update is instead a piece of software or code published by the vendor of that product or system to resolve the vulnerability. With that being said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. If a vulnerability exists in a product or system, but no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit. Also, before we get into the latest updates since the year started, how do we prioritize them? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first is going to be the vendor severity. This typically ranges from critical severity to NA, or not applicable, and it comes directly from the manufacturer of that update. It is important to always check the vendor severity of any updates. However, do bear in mind that it can clearly be a biased rating. Many third-party updates don't receive severities from their manufacturers, as in some cases, of course, it would highlight that product or application in a negative light. To combat this, we instead prioritize the industry severity more, such as the CVSS score, which stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And that's actually calculated by an independent organization. This score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical. The higher the rating, it typically entails higher possibility of exploitation, and of course, increases our priority. Then we deal with the state of the vulnerability, such as it being weaponized. This means that it's being actively exploited in the wild and can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means the structure or blueprint of the bug has been exposed to the industry as well. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's currently being exploited, but that the details are out there on how to weaponize it. These are typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, or sometimes the manufacturer. Many security organizations are typically the ones that are going to be disclosing these. Countermeasures are also a possibility and are provided actually in 2 ways. Either a mitigation, such as configuration from an antivirus or an EDR, that is stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying a patch to resolve it. The other measure is considered a workaround, such as a registry tweak, a policy change, service configuration, and that also prevents the vulnerability from being exploited in the first place. A great example of this is when Microsoft provides a recommended policy or registry change without the need to deploy out one of its out-of-band updates. We saw this recently in the last year with a vulnerability called Felina, in which there was about a 2.5 week gap between when they announced it at the beginning of the month and about two weeks until Patch Tuesday. That's when they actually resolved the patch. But in the meantime, they've supplied a countermeasure in the meantime, which was actually a registry tweak to go ahead and resolve that particular vulnerability. Finally, the 6th factor in determining our strategy is the exposure. Every environment is different, and typically it includes various versions of operating systems. Knowing where said vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target our endpoints for remediation. Okay, so The third-party products we'll be discussing today have all received updates since the year started, as mentioned earlier, and going forward, we'll be starting at Patch Tuesday. And all of these are all resolve some sort of vulnerability, as well as there are some potential zero-day exploits. We'll discuss it briefly, but actually, fortunately, there haven't really been any. Also, all products mentioned have advisories from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to update as soon as possible. First, Adobe dropped a number of updates across various products. Adobe issued advisories across 4 separate product lines between Windows and macOS. These products include Acrobat and Reader, InDesign, InCopy, and Dimension. Among all products, Adobe resolved 32 separate vulnerabilities, with most unfortunately being critical in nature, or it's actually pretty much the typical month after month for the last 5 years, I could say, is that most of them have been rated critical. Acrobat Reader received updates to resolve 18 separate vulnerabilities, with 11 of them getting CVSS scores of 7.8, although Adobe marked these as critical. Typically on the CVSS scale, that would be in more of the high category. With CVSS scoring, critical starts at 9.0 and above, but for the manufacturer, they still rate it as critical. So it is, of course, still very important. The rest of the vulnerabilities patched are getting a lower important rating, with CVSS scores of instead 6.4 and below, which is just kind of near the bottom of the high severity category. The various categories include integer overflow or wraparound, out of bounds read and write, null pointer dereference, stack-based buffer overflow, improper input validation, type confusion, violation of secure design principles, and use after free flaws. Quite a few. The latest release for Acrobat and Reader also patches Acrobat and Reader DC and Classic 2020, not 2017 or earlier versions. It's also worth noting that Adobe does provide a priority rating along with their security bulletins, and Acrobat and Reader received a typical priority of 3. In fact, all of the versions here, all of the products received a lower priority of 3. Since that priority rating if lower is more concerning, this means that the products, according to Adobe, are not at elevated risk of being exploited. So actually, the lower we go in priority, the more important it is. Sometimes we receive 2s, seeing quite a few in the last year. Haven't seen 1 actually at this point yet, haven't seen that yet, but of course, it's always possible. Typically, they stamp their product updates again with a priority of 3, so again, lesser chance of being exploited. Adobe InDesign received an update for Windows and macOS to resolve 6 vulnerabilities, 4 of them critical with CVSS scores of, again, 7.8. These include fixes for heap-based buffer overflow and out-of-bounds read and write. Adobe InCopy received an update to resolve 6 similar vulnerabilities, with 4 of them being critical in nature and affecting Windows and macOS. And lastly, Adobe Dimension resolved 2 flaws with important severity, but only CVSS scores of 5.5. Google Chrome, always my favorite to talk about, has had actually only 1 release for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux since last month. The single update in January to Chrome version 109 included 17 security fixes, with 14 of them being discovered by external researchers. Most of the externally reported bugs are medium and low severity flaws, with only 2 of them actually rated as high severity. These 2 include a use after free issue in overview mode, tracked as CVE 2023-0128, and a heap buffer overflow bug in network service, tracked as CVE 2023-0129. 5 of the 8 medium severity bugs with this release are classified as inappropriate implementation flaws within Chrome components, and the remaining issues include use after free vulnerabilities in cart and heap buffer overflow in platform apps. Digging a little deeper, Google apparently paid out $39,000 US in bug bounty rewards, but that final amount actually may be higher, as one of the medium severity issues has yet to be determined, according to Chrome's release notes page. I always urge, if anyone's ever interested, you can actually go to the release notes page. It'll actually tell you how much was paid out. And based on the external researchers who actually provided it. Quite interesting. One reason I always like to talk about Chrome, a few details from the past few years. In 2021, Google Chrome had 16 zero-day exploits. That's crazy. In 2022, it had 9 0 days, so things have been getting a little bit better. And as well, following suit, this year is looking healthy. There is no zero-day exploit, but we're only just a few weeks in. I do always mention that Chrome is by far the most popular web browser out there, and that makes it actually malicious attackers' preferred target. Regarding updating Chrome, as always, the browser should auto-update for any consumers, but any administrators out there, do be sure to double check and update accordingly, especially if any end users don't have administrative rights to their devices. Following suit with Chrome, any vulnerabilities resolved in Chrome also affect other Chromium-based browsers, such as the popular Microsoft Edge. Edge received 7 updates since the year started, with 3 releases addressing Edge-specific vulnerabilities. The January 12th update of Edge resolved 2 additional vulnerabilities. The first is tracked as CVE 2023-21775, related to remote code execution. It has a higher CVSS score of 8.3, but fortunately, exploitation is less likely for Microsoft. The second vulnerability resolved is tracked as CVE 2023-21796, related to elevation of privilege, also having a higher CVSS score of 8.3. And again, fortunately, exploitation is still less likely according to Microsoft. This monthly feature release also added, by the way, feature releases are released monthly with Edge. So this release includes a lot of other changes, not just for security fixes. It added 3 new features and 8 new policies for administrators, including text prediction, which is quite interesting. Microsoft then resolved an additional product-specific vulnerability 1 day later on January 13th to address another elevation of privilege flaw with a CVSS score of 8.3 and, fortunately, also less likely to be exploited. Lastly, the January 19th release of Edge contained another Edge-specific fix for security feature bypass vulnerability with a CVSS score of 6.5. Given that some Edge-specific vulnerabilities here are, of course, near critical with an 8.3 score, doesn't quite reach critical on the CVSS scale, but it's near critical, clearly right at the top end of being high severity. I do strongly recommend for everyone using Edge to prioritize the newest versions. Mozilla Firefox, one of my personal favorites, I always want to bring up here, as well because they always disclose, as the vendor, their own vulnerabilities too, so I always have to respect that. They've released only 2 updates since last month, including an additional update for extended support release users. Mozilla first dropped a Firefox update on January 5th, bringing Firefox to version 108.0.2, and including a few minor fixes. Nothing really to highlight there. However, the second release on January 17th brought Firefox actually to version 109. And this version now offers Manifest version 3 extension support, improved security measures for Windows users, Spanish language enhancements, as well as 10 security fixes. Of those 10 fixes, 4 are considered high severity and resolve a logic bug in process allocation that could allow reading of arbitrary files as well as memory safety bugs. Lower severity fixes include fixes for malicious commands, notification permissions, and content security policies weren't being properly or correctly applied to WebSockets and web workers. And then I'd also like to note, since it typically follows suit, Mozilla Thunderbird also received an update on January 19th, resolving pretty much similar issues in Firefox, providing multiple performance enhancements too. Lastly, Oracle's quarterly January critical patch update advisory, again, Oracle drops these quarterly, included 3 fixes for Java deployments. However, this is out of 327 total security patches for all of Oracle's products. Fortunately, I won't get too in-depth on these. Actually, with Java specifically, they're only given CVSS scores of 5.3, 5.3, and 3.7. So not really high on the scale, but still something to note. Of course, in general, everybody should be updating Java regularly. Administrators, I do strongly caution if you have any applications that are dependent on Java, of course, be sure to recognize that. You might not be able to push, say, a Java update in your systems management solution to all devices. You might actually have to set some deviations. But as well, overall, if you have solutions that can't get the latest versions of Java, do think about that solution as well being a potential vulnerability in itself. All three vulnerabilities in Java can be remotely exploited without authentication as well. So although the three that were patched recently are not high on the scale, they don't require authentication to exploit. Any other Java-based products as well, such as Amazon Corretto, there are quite a few out there that utilize the open build. We're also clearly affected by these vulnerabilities, and you'll still also want to update when possible. I'm also only highlighting Java's update specifically. Of course, as mentioned, there are a lot of other Oracle products that were updated in this quarterly advisory. I strongly urge anybody using Oracle products to check the advisory and update where necessary. Some additional products have also seen updates since the start of the year. These include Amazon Workspaces, Bitwarden, Citrix products, Dropbox, Drupal, Jenkins, Malwarebytes, Opera, Samba, Skype, Snagit, VirtualBox, WebEx, WinRare, Wireshark, and Zoom. My monthly reminder to all administrators, please include third-party patching in your patch deployment process. It is not only about the operating system updates. I read a figure in the last few years that I always like to share. Out of all vulnerabilities, pretty much only about 20% are actually the operating systems themselves. Of course, any other application can be considered a vulnerability too. Now, a bit of a sidestep here since we are typically discussing third-party updates. I did want to throw Apple in here just because something interesting happened in the last few days. Apple dropped a number of products or dropped patches for a number of products with an advisory on January 23rd. The most serious of the documented vulnerabilities affect WebKit and can expose both iOS and macOS devices to code execution attacks via specially crafted web content, Apple warned. Total fixes include all currently supported versions of macOS. That includes Big Sur with 8 fixes, Monterey with 18 fixes, and Ventura topping out at 26 total fixes. iOS 12.5.7, which I did not know was still supported. Clearly it is. Was released to patch the still supported older models like iPhone 5S and iPhone 6. iOS and iPadOS 15.7.3 received 5 security fixes, while versions 16.3 received 13 total fixes. Safari 16.3 was also released and addressed 3 items, all WebKit related, so do be sure to update there. Should see that as well in your software updates or in your app store. Leaving watchOS as well, which received 12 security fixes, which I thought was interesting. I typically don't see, I have an Apple Watch, don't see too many updates coming through, but I have gotten that notification in the last couple of days, and I do need to actually update as well. Again, I know Apple doesn't really count as, say, a third-party product, but since the advisory came out, I wanted to cover it on this webcast to inform my audience since clearly this just dropped, and there were a lot of products affected by it. Of course, for any third-party products on Apple devices, do be sure to check your App Store and update accordingly. I hope that this has been informative and useful. If you enjoy the new short form of this webcast, please contact us and let us know. If you have any further questions, concerns, or suggestions for improvement, we would love to hear it. Thanks for your time and happy patching.